Hi, my name's Dean. I've been asked to give you a bit of an update today on the progress of the new Act replacing the Property Agents and Motor Dealers Act. As you no doubt aware, we've been operating under that one since 2000. We've seen a few different versions of it, a few different permutations along the way. Its original commencement created a great deal of confusion for real estate agents. With all its various requirements. We saw some of them improve over time. We saw some that didn't improve over time. We've now been promised that we'll have an easier process now. These new acts that have been enacted will help us refine and reduce the red tape in what we do. It remains to be seen exactly how beneficial that actually does work out to be. We've gone from one act, the Property Agents Motor Dealers Act, which involved real estate agents, motor dealers and commercial agents. That's now been pulled apart into 4 acts, and the 2 acts that relate to your business as a real estate agent, the Property Occupation Act of 2014 and the Agents Financial Administration Act of 2014. Now, the Agents Financial Administration Act 2014, primarily what it's done, it's pulled out the trust accounting part of Property Agents Motor Dealers Act and have it in its own act. And the Property Occupation Act relates to how you operate as a real estate agent, licensing, transactions, etc. Now, this is just an update today because the real operative part of the Act is involved in the regulations. As you're well aware, the current Property Agents and Motor Dealers Act has the Property Agents and Motor Dealers regulations, has the codes of conducts for real estate agents and for auctioneers and so on. Plus we've got the regulations themselves. So they're the operative parts. They tell us what forms we need, the actual nuts and bolts of how we operate. Now, even though these new acts have been enacted and they gained royal assent on the 21st of May 2014, they haven't commenced, the commencement date will be after proclamation. It would be probably likely that we won't see the commencement of these acts until such time as all the regulations that will operate under these new acts have been put in place. So they're the operative parts, and it may be some months before we see it actually come into effect. So I would suggest the first thing is, in the meantime, don't change anything that you're doing. While this new acts have gained royal assent, they're not in operation yet. You're still operating under the Property Agents and Motor Dealers Act and its regulations. So you just need to continue to do what you're currently doing. Now, what are some of the changes we're likely to see or that are involved in the new Act? Licensing. Some of the things that have changed are the property developers and employees no longer have to be licensed to sell property belonging to a property developer. You will no longer need to have as a licensee, need to have an employment register. You'll no longer need to display your real estate licence. It will need to be available on request, but it won't need to be displayed as it currently is in the office. And an employed licensee can also be in charge now of a principal place of residence office. So if, for example, you as a licensee have a number of different offices, there were some problems there, in the past about who was the licensee in charge. Now the Act will allow for an employed individual who is has a full licence to be the licensee in charge of your office. People working for sophisticated clients will be exempt. So that would likely entail people who are working, commercial agents in particular, working for retail shopping centres, etc., will no longer need to be licensed. But as I said earlier, the nuts and bolts of how this will work, we won't know until the regulations have been promulgated. Some of the changes with transactions, there's going to be a deregulation of commission. But looking at the Act, it's not entirely deregulated. You will be restricted in some ways about how you charge commission. The commission will still need to be a percentage of the sale price, if that's what's agreed. It would appear that you could also charge a flat fee, but if the fee is based on a percentage, the fee that you charge, the commissioner can charge, must be based on the sales price of the property. If you're renting, if you're property manager, it will need to be the percentage of the rental income. It looks like they're going to remove the requirement to disclose to the buyer the amount of commission that the agent receives. Agency appointments. They're saying that the forms are going to be reduced. How that actually works, we won't know until we see the regulations and the forms that are required. As we've seen in the past, while they might have good intentions, often the difficulty arises when you as an agent has to fill out the form that was designed by, often a public servant. And so we get to the situation, what do we do if this happens, or what do we do if that happens? It's sometimes difficult. But on the face of it, they're reducing all the different appointment forms down to one. So it remains to be seen how simple that is, or whether it in fact becomes something that's more complicated. Sole and exclusive agencies are going to be increased from a maximum from 60 days to 90 days. You will still not be able to renew the appointment before 14 days towards the end of the existing appointment. You'll still need to use the approved form, and if you don't use the approved form, you'll have an appointment that is ineffective. If it's a continuing appointment, you'll no longer have to have an end date, so a continuing appointment will in fact be that, a continuing appointment. In relation to the Agents Financial Administrative Act, I won't go into too much of that today. It looks for the most part as if that's basically been pulled out of the existing Act and put into the new Act, or a separate Act. Again, at a later date, once we know the details, once the regulations that are going to impact on us there come into place, we'll be able to have another one of these sessions and going into that in more detail. But until we have those regulations, we're a bit restricted. But the object of the Act, and I'll read them out to you, the main object of this Act is to protect consumers from the financial loss in dealings with agents regulated under an Agents Act. The object is to be achieved mainly by regulating the way agents establish, manage and audit trust accounts, and establishing a claim fund to compensate persons in particular circumstances for financial losses arising from dealings with agents, and promoting administrative efficiency for claims made against the claim fund. So that's the main objects of the Act. The actual nuts and bolts of how we operate that we'll look at later. I would envisage that there won't be any huge significant changes to the current way that you operate. So in relation to transactions, there's going to be a deregulation of commission, simplification of the warning statements. One of the other things that is a significant change, it'll be interesting to see how this impacts, is that up until now, if there was a beneficial interest, if you as an agent were wanted to sell a property that was a listing within your office, there was a restriction on you getting a commission. You could act and sell the property, but you couldn't claim a commission against the seller. And on the face of it, that seems fair enough, because there appears to be a direct conflict of interest. You as a seller have a duty to get the best price you possibly can for, you as an agent have a duty to get the best possible price you can for the seller. Whereas if you were a buyer, of course, you're trying to get a property for as little as you can possibly can. So there seems to be a conflict, and that was addressed by the restriction on beneficial interest. Now, they're removing that restriction on getting a commission on a beneficial interest sale, providing that the seller agrees beforehand and that the seller is not left in a position that is substantially different than they would have been if there was no beneficial interest. So it remains to be seen whether that becomes problematic or not. I see there's a direct conflict with that, and we won't really see that perhaps played out or know the real implications of that until it's played out at some stage in court. But, you know, it may not present a problem. There's also a simplification of the process in relation to cooling off periods. As you'd be well aware, the 5-day cooling off period can be waived or reduced, but that would require, in the past, it's required a certificate signed by a lawyer for that to happen. That appears no longer to be a requirement. The cooling off period is still there, but it can be reduced apparently by a simple notice from the buyer to the seller, reducing that cooling off period. But again, the nuts and bolts of this we won't know until we see the regulations and how that applies to the Act. And one of the key changes now in this new Act is that QCAT is specifically mentioned. QCAT has a section there towards the back of the Act where it says that QCAT has the jurisdiction in deciding of matters between real estate agents, disputes between agents and principals, and also relating to matters where people want to bring in a claim against a real estate agent. QCAT now is the designated under the statute area of jurisdiction. So we know it's changing. We know there's some simplification, but sometimes, you know, until we're in there practicing it, we don't know whether it's how much simpler it is, and whether there's some areas that will still need to be changed. And as for those of you who've been around for a few years, remember with PAMDA, there was quite a few of those, especially when they certainly brought it in 2000. After we as agents were trying to apply it out in the real world, we found that there were some major problems, and they made a few modifications along the way. Hopefully this Act won't require that, and we get in there, it's all smooth sailing, but we'll just have to wait and see how that happens. In the meantime, continue to do what you're currently doing. The new Act is not in place yet, and it won't happen until we've got the regulations. And we'll give you later updates as to how and when that will happen. Thank you.